Get up, ma'am. You must come with us.
Please, I have done nothing wrong.
They mocked a homeless grandmother in court, but had no idea who was watching silently. When 72-year-old Eleanor Jenkins stood accused of trespassing in Westfield County Court, Judge Hargrove's mockery drew snickers from the gallery. None of them noticed the well-dressed woman who slipped quietly into the back row, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's dignified face. Westfield County Courthouse reeked of industrial disinfectant and institutional despair, where fluorescent lights cast judgment across cracked vinyl seats that had absorbed decades of human anxiety. The morning air hung thick with whispered conversations and shuffled papers, while bailiffs stood guard over proceedings that reduced complex lives to case numbers. Outside, November rain streaked windows that separated justice from the street, where dignity was measured by one's ability to afford representation rather than the weight of their character. Eleanor Jenkins clutched a plastic shopping bag containing every document proving she'd once been somebody: mortgage papers from a house lost to medical bills, employee records from 15 years as head housekeeper at Parkview Towers, and a faded photograph of her late husband Robert in his Army uniform. At 72, she maintained the posture that 43 years of home ownership and steady employment had instilled, though 6 months of homelessness had worn her Sunday dress thin and frayed the edges of her carefully preserved dignity. What the court couldn't see were invisible battles carved into her weathered hands. 18 months of watching Robert die slowly from cancer while medical bills devoured their savings, the foreclosure she couldn't fight while grieving, and the systematic discovery that American society treated elderly homelessness as moral failure rather than economic catastrophe. She'd once held keys to luxury apartments. Now she held only memories and stubborn pride. Eleanor's challenge transcended legal technicalities. She had indeed sought shelter without permission. Her battle was existential. How do you prove your worth when society sees only your current circumstances? How do you maintain dignity when institutions treat poverty as character failure? She was fighting to be recognized as a complete person whose past contributions mattered more than her present desperation. Judge William Hargrove processed Eleanor's case with mechanical efficiency, his expression suggesting homeless defendants were administrative inconveniences rather than human beings requiring careful consideration. The courtroom gallery held the usual mixture of defendants awaiting their turns and law students observing legal procedures that would become abstract case studies rather than lived experiences of systematic injustice. Eleanor Jenkins, criminal trespassing at Parkview Towers on November 15th. How do you plead? Eleanor rose slowly, arthritis making sudden movements painful. Guilty, Your Honor, but may I explain? Simple yes or no, Mrs. Jenkins. Guilty or not guilty? The interruption hung in the air like smoke from distant gunfire, immediately establishing power dynamics that reduced Eleanor's complex circumstances to binary legal categories. She felt the weight of watching eyes, some sympathetic, others judgmental, all processing her transformation from productive citizen to criminal defendant through circumstances beyond her control. Guilty, Your Honor. Hargrove's response revealed institutional contempt disguised as judicial efficiency. Mrs. Jenkins, this court sees dozens of trespassing cases monthly. Everyone has circumstances, everyone has explanations. The law doesn't recognize homelessness as justification for criminal behavior. But Eleanor's dignity refused to be diminished by bureaucratic dismissal. Your Honor, I worked in that building for 15 years. I wasn't destroying property or causing harm. I was seeking shelter to survive sub-freezing temperatures when the emergency shelter was full. Her explanation drew snickers from the gallery, particularly from younger observers who interpreted her circumstances as evidence of personal failure rather than systematic inadequacy of social support systems. The laughter cut deeper than Hargrove's legal dismissal, revealing how quickly society transformed compassion into entertainment when poverty made people vulnerable to public humiliation. "How convenient," Hargrove replied, his tone designed to provoke either anger or tears that would justify treating her as emotionally unstable rather than simply desperate. Eleanor's response demonstrated wisdom earned through decades of navigating systems that punished honesty while rewarding performance. Instead of defending herself further or breaking down under pressure, she maintained composure that seemed to irritate the judge more than emotional outbursts would have. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with unexpected authority. "I accept legal responsibility for my actions, but I maintain that seeking shelter to survive isn't moral failure, it's human necessity." The words settled over the courtroom like settling dust, creating uncomfortable recognition among observers that they were witnessing something more complex than simple legal procedure. Margaret Chen, a retired teacher in the gallery, shifted uncomfortably as Eleanor's quiet dignity reminded her of clients she'd once helped navigate systems designed to punish poverty rather than address its causes. Unknown to everyone present, a well-dressed woman had slipped into the back row during Eleanor's testimony, her expensive suit contrasting sharply with the shabby clothing that marked most defendants awaiting their turns. Her attention focused immediately on Eleanor, with recognition that transcended casual observation. Judge Hargrove's treatment of Eleanor escalated from dismissive efficiency to calculated cruelty, his questions designed not to understand her circumstances, but to demonstrate institutional power over someone who couldn't retaliate effectively. Each exchange revealed bias that transformed courtrooms from places of justice into theaters of humiliation for people whose only crime was economic vulnerability. "So, Mrs. Jenkins, you decided your comfort was more important than respecting property rights?" Hargrove's tone dripped with sarcasm that drew more uncomfortable laughter from gallery observers who were slowly becoming complicit in systematic dehumanization. "No, Your Honor," Eleanor replied with dignity that seemed to frustrate his attempts to provoke emotional breakdown. "I decided that surviving below freezing temperatures was worth legal consequences. I would have left if asked politely. I was trying to avoid damage or disturbance." The mysterious woman in the back row leaned forward, her hands clenching as she watched Eleanor absorb attacks designed to destroy self-worth rather than serve justice. Her expression suggested personal investment in Eleanor's treatment that transcended casual courtroom observation. Other observers began recognizing that they were witnessing institutional cruelty rather than legal procedure. James Rodriguez, a court reporter with 15 years of experience, noticed Eleanor's careful speech patterns and respectful demeanor characteristics that distinguished her from defendants who habitually manipulated legal systems for personal advantage. Margaret Chen found herself remembering social work clients who'd faced identical circumstances, elderly people whose lifetime contributions were erased by medical bankruptcies and housing costs that exceeded fixed incomes designed for economies that no longer existed. But the mysterious observer remained focused entirely on Eleanor, her expression shifting from recognition to growing anger as she processed the systematic humiliation being inflicted on someone she apparently knew personally. When Hargrove's mockery drew particularly cruel laughter from younger gallery members, her jaw tightened with barely controlled fury. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Eleanor had said, and several observers recognized profound truth in words that Judge Hargrove had dismissed as irrelevant to legal proceedings designed to process cases rather than serve human dignity. "Mrs. Jenkins," Hargrove announced with satisfaction that revealed personal pleasure in exercising power over vulnerable people, "you will pay $300 in fines and court costs, or complete 60 hours of community service. Given your financial circumstances, I assume you'll choose community service." The calculation was designed to demonstrate authority while offering apparent mercy that was actually additional punishment. 60 hours of unpaid labor for someone struggling to survive represented further hardship disguised as judicial compassion. Eleanor stood to accept the sentence with dignity that remained unbroken despite systematic attempts to destroy it. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll complete the community service requirements." "Next case," Hargrove called dismissively, already reaching for the next file that would transform another human being into administrative processing. But as Eleanor gathered her plastic bag and prepared to leave the defendant's table, the well-dressed woman in the back row stood suddenly, her movement creating subtle disturbance that drew attention from nearby observers who'd been watching her increasingly agitated responses to the proceedings. "Your Honor," the woman called out, her voice carrying authority that immediately commanded attention from people accustomed to deferential behavior in judicial settings. "I request permission to address the court regarding this case." Hargrove looked up irritably, his expression suggesting unwillingness to allow proceedings to be disrupted by unexpected interventions. But the woman's obvious wealth and professional demeanor created hesitation. Judges learned to treat people with resources differently than those without social protection. "This case is concluded," Hargrove replied carefully. "Unless you have legal standing, I have personal knowledge relevant to Mrs. Jenkins' character and her connection to the property in question," the woman interrupted, moving forward with confidence that suggested familiarity with legal environments. "I believe this information is material to appropriate sentencing." Eleanor turned in confusion, trying to place the well-dressed stranger who seemed to know details about her circumstances. Recognition flickered at the edges of memory, but years and changed circumstances made identification difficult until the woman moved closer and Eleanor could see her face clearly. The courtroom held its collective breath, sensing that routine proceedings were about to become something unprecedented. The woman approached the bench with practiced confidence, her movement creating ripple effects throughout the courtroom as observers processed the shift from routine sentencing to unexpected drama. Her expensive clothing and professional bearing commanded respect that Eleanor's dignity alone couldn't secure from Judge Hargrove, revealing systematic bias that valued social status over human worth. "Your Honor," she began formally, "I apologize for the interruption, but I have been observing these proceedings with growing concern about how this court has treated Mrs. Jenkins." Hargrove's expression shifted from irritation to calculation as he processed implications of criticism from someone whose obvious wealth suggested potential political connections. "And you are?" "Someone who knows Mrs. Jenkins personally and can speak to her character, her contributions to this community, and her connection to the property where she sought shelter." Eleanor stared in growing recognition, memory struggling to place the face that seemed familiar despite changed circumstances. The woman's presence suggested resources and authority that transcended the poverty that had defined Eleanor's recent experience, but her personal knowledge implied relationship that Eleanor couldn't immediately identify. "I'm afraid standard procedure requires—" Hargrove began, but the woman's interruption revealed preparation that suggested calculated intervention rather than impulsive advocacy. "Mrs. Jenkins," the woman said, turning to address Eleanor directly, while maintaining formal distance that preserved dramatic tension, "you may not recognize me immediately. It's been 7 years since we last spoke, and circumstances have changed dramatically for both of us." Eleanor studied the woman's face, recognition slowly dawning as features became familiar despite years and prosperity that had transformed appearance. I think I remember you, but I'm not certain." "Your Honor," the woman continued, returning attention to Hargrove while maintaining mystery about her specific identity, "Mrs. Jenkins worked for 15 years as head of housekeeping services at Parkview Towers. During that time, she demonstrated exceptional integrity, compassion, and dedication that went far beyond job requirements." The revelation created context that complicated Hargrove's simple narrative of criminal trespassing, transforming Eleanor from stranger to someone with legitimate connection to the property. But the woman's careful avoidance of identifying herself maintained suspense that was building toward climactic revelation. "Professional references are commendable," Hargrove replied cautiously, "but they don't excuse criminal behavior." "What if I told you?" the woman said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "that Mrs. Jenkins once saved a life in that building? That her quick thinking and compassionate action prevented a tragedy that would have destroyed a family?" Eleanor gasped as memory connected the woman's face with circumstances she'd never expected to encounter again in legal proceedings. Mrs. Morrison, Catherine Morrison?" "Catherine Winters now," the woman corrected gently. "But yes, and I have never forgotten what you did for my family on March 15th, 2017. The date meant nothing to courtroom observers, but Eleanor's face transformed as she remembered the emergency that had changed everything for the Morrison family, now the Winters family. The specific reference created dramatic tension while providing evidence of authentic relationship between accuser and defender. Judge Hargrove found himself facing unprecedented situation. Someone with obvious wealth and authority was defending a homeless defendant with specific knowledge that challenged his assumptions about Eleanor's character and worthiness of judicial mercy. "Mrs. Winters," Hargrove said carefully, "while personal testimonials are appreciated, this court must base decisions on legal facts rather than emotional appeals." But Catherine's response would transform everyone's understanding of both Eleanor's character and the systematic injustice they just witnessed. Catherine Winters faced the courtroom with authority earned through wealth, but motivated by debt that transcended financial calculation. Her revelation would expose not just Eleanor's hidden heroism, but the systematic bias that had reduced a life-saving hero to a criminal defendant, subjected to public humiliation. Your Honor, Catherine said clearly, on March 15, 2017, my husband David collapsed from a massive heart attack in our penthouse apartment at Parkview Towers. I was overseas on business, and David was alone except for Mrs. Jenkins, who was cleaning our apartment. The courtroom fell silent as observers processed the beginning of a story that would transform their understanding of Eleanor's worth and character. Judge Hargrove leaned forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by reluctant attention to testimony that promised complications he hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Jenkins didn't just call for help. She performed CPR that kept David alive until paramedics arrived. The doctor said her quick action saved his life. But that wasn't all, Catherine continued, her voice carrying emotion that years hadn't diminished. 3 months later, when I miscarried our first pregnancy, Mrs. Jenkins stayed with me through the night, holding my hand while I grieved the child we'd lost. She missed her own family obligations to comfort a woman she barely knew because she understood that grief requires human presence. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes, remembering nights when professional duty had extended into personal compassion because suffering people needed comfort more than she needed to maintain professional boundaries. The courtroom gallery sat in stunned silence as they processed transformation of criminal defendant into unrecognized hero. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Catherine said, looking directly at Judge Hargrove, and Mrs. Jenkins has been fighting battles for others her entire life while asking for nothing in return. This woman, Catherine said, gesturing toward Eleanor, has been criminalized for seeking shelter in a building where she saved lives and provided comfort to grieving families. She's been mocked and humiliated for circumstances created by medical bills from her husband's terminal cancer circumstances that could affect anyone in this courtroom. Judge Hargrove shifted uncomfortably as his earlier mockery was recontextualized as cruelty directed at someone whose character exceeded his own moral authority. The laughter from gallery observers now seemed like evidence of systematic failure rather than appropriate response to judicial procedure. I own 3 apartment buildings and employ dozens of people, Catherine continued, but I have never encountered anyone with Mrs. Jenkins' combination of competence, integrity, and compassion. Her homelessness represents systematic failure, not personal inadequacy. Your Honor, Catherine said, her voice taking on edge of controlled anger. I watched you mock this woman for seeking warmth in a building where she once worked to maintain other people's comfort. I heard you reduce her to a stereotype while she maintained dignity that most people couldn't preserve under such systematic humiliation. The challenge hung in the courtroom like accusation against judicial authority that rarely faced accountability from people with resources to demand better treatment. Hargrove found himself in unprecedented position of having his bias exposed by someone whose social status made retaliation impossible. Mrs. Jenkins doesn't need charity. She needs justice. She doesn't need pity. She needs recognition of her worth and contributions. And this court needs to acknowledge that poverty isn't criminality, that homelessness isn't moral failure, and that human dignity transcends current circumstances. Eleanor stood slowly, her dignity intact despite attempts to destroy it through systematic humiliation. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," she said to the entire courtroom. "But some battles create strength that can't be destroyed by circumstances and compassion that can't be diminished by poverty." Judge Hargrove sat in stunned silence, processing the collision between institutional authority and moral clarity that had transformed routine proceedings into examination of systematic bias he'd never questioned. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier dismissive certainty. "Mrs. Jenkins," he began carefully, "I owe you a profound apology. My treatment of your case was inappropriate and failed to uphold the dignity this court should represent." The admission created ripple effects throughout the courtroom as observers witnessed unprecedented judicial acknowledgement of bias and systematic failure that rarely faced direct challenge. Judge Hargrove dismissed all charges against Eleanor and personally apologized to the courtroom for his conduct, while Catherine offered Eleanor stable housing and a position coordinating services for elderly residents facing similar circumstances. The case sparked county-wide reforms requiring sensitivity training for judicial personnel and systematic review of bias in handling homeless defendants. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Eleanor told the media gathering outside the courthouse. "But when those battles are fought with dignity and supported by people who recognize worth beyond circumstances, even systematic injustice can be overcome." Catherine's housing development project expanded to serve hundreds of elderly individuals whose circumstances mirrored Eleanor's former situation, while Eleanor found renewed purpose advocating for people whose invisible battles deserved recognition rather than criminalization. 2 years later, Eleanor's court case had become required study in judicial ethics programs, while Catherine's housing initiative had influenced state legislation addressing elderly homelessness through support rather than punishment. Eleanor discovered that her greatest battles had prepared her to help others fight theirs, while Catherine learned that wealth's greatest value lay in its ability to defend dignity when systematic bias attacked the vulnerable. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people society has forgotten, but recognition can transform individual tragedy into systematic change when courage meets resources willing to challenge institutional cruelty. The strongest people are usually fighting battles you know nothing about, and sometimes those battles create heroes whose worth transcends their circumstances, teaching us that dignity can't be destroyed by poverty when it's defended by those who remember that everyone deserves justice regardless of their current address.